Flight 4A2 to Washington is now boarding passengers, requiring additional assistance. People barely looked up. Business travelers rushed towards security with coffee in one hand and phones in the other. Parents called after excited children. Suitcases rolled across polished floors, blending into the steady rhythm every busy airport seemed to share. Near Gate 34, a black woman stood quietly beside a small carry-on bag. She wore a navy blazer, simple slacks, and comfortable shoes. Nothing about her invited attention. She checked the departure screen, glanced at her watch, then slipped her phone back into her pocket. An older man nearby smiled politely. "Looks like they're running on time for once." She returned the smile. "That's becoming rare these days." He chuckled. "I'll believe it when we're in the air." She nodded without saying anything else. A young mother struggled to fold a stroller while holding her toddler. The woman stepped forward. "Would you like a hand?" "Oh, yes, please." "Thank you." Together they folded the stroller in seconds. "I appreciate that." The mother said, "You're welcome." The child waved. "Bye." She smiled. "Have a good flight." Nothing about the exchange lasted more than a few seconds. Yet several people nearby noticed how naturally she helped without expecting thanks. A gate agent looked in her direction before returning to the computer screen. Everything felt ordinary, exactly the way ordinary mornings are supposed to feel. Across the terminal, 2 uniformed police officers entered through a side corridor. One of them looked down at a phone. "You sure this is the gate?" His partner nodded. Anonymous caller said she's waiting right here. Description: black female, professional clothes, small carry-on. The first officer scanned the waiting passengers. His eyes stopped on her almost immediately. "There!" Without another word, both officers began walking toward Gate 34. The conversations around them continued. Nobody realized that within moments, an ordinary morning would become the beginning of a story the entire country would remember. The 2 officers walked with steady, confident steps, their attention fixed on the woman near Gate 34. Around them, travelers continued their conversations, unaware that a quiet accusation was about to outweigh everything visible before their eyes. One officer slowed as he reached her. "Ma'am." She turned calmly. "Yes, officer. We need to ask you a few questions." The older gentleman she had spoken with moments earlier looked between them, but remained seated. She answered politely, "Of course. What seems to be the problem?" The younger officer glanced at the screen on his phone. "We received a report about a suspicious woman matching your description." She frowned slightly. "My description: black female, business clothes, small carry-on." A brief silence followed. She looked down at her suitcase before meeting his eyes again. "That describes a lot of travelers." Neither officer responded. Instead, the older one asked, "May we see your identification?" She reached slowly toward her purse. "I'm gonna get my wallet." "Keep your hands where we can see them first." She stopped. Immediately, "All right, nearby." Passengers began paying attention. A businessman whispered, "Must be something serious." His coworker nodded. They don't stop people for no reason. No one asked what evidence the officers actually had. The anonymous phone call had already become more believable than the composed woman standing before them. Their young mother, she had helped only minutes, earlier looked confused. "She was just helping me," she murmured to her husband. He gently pulled her arm. "Don't get involved." The words settled heavily between them. The officers exchanged a quick glance, reassured by the crowd's silence. Authority was already working in their favor. The woman noticed people stepping back, creating distance, as though suspicion might spread from one person to another. Inside, disappointment surfaced, but years of experience kept it from reaching her face. She had seen this look before. The look that asked no questions, because it believed assumptions first. She simply stood still, waiting for someone to choose facts over fear. Within moments, the silence around the officers transformed into something far more dangerous. People began supplying details that had never been spoken. I heard she refused to cooperate. One traveler whispered. Another answered. Someone said she's been acting strangely all morning. Third nodded with complete confidence. Security wouldn't be here unless they knew something. Each sentence traveled farther than the last. By the time it reached the opposite side of the boarding area, the anonymous complaint had become an unquestioned story. The woman remained exactly where she was. Her hands were visible. Her carry-on sat untouched beside her. She had raised neither her voice nor her posture. Yet almost no one looked at what was actually happening. They looked at the uniforms. The older gentleman who had joked with her about the flight shifted uneasily. "This doesn't seem right," he murmured. His wife squeezed his arm. "Please, don't say anything." He looked toward the officers, then toward the woman. Finally, he looked down. Nearby, 2 airport employees stood behind the gate counter. "Do you know what's going on?" One quietly asked. The other shrugged. "No idea. Should we ask?" She hesitated only a second. "The police are handling it." That answer ended the conversation. Facts no longer seemed necessary. Authority had replaced them. Another passenger lifted his suitcase and deliberately moved several seats away from the woman. Others followed without speaking. The distance grew with every passing second. She noticed the widening circle around her but refused to let disappointment show. She had learned long ago that fear spreads faster than truth. The lead officer watched the crowd settle behind him without realizing it. Their silent agreement strengthened his confidence. No one challenged his judgment. No one requested evidence. No one asked the simplest question of all. What exactly did she do? Instead, the terminal accepted a story, still missing its most important part. The truth stood quietly in the center of the crowd. Almost everyone walked around it. No one moved. The boarding lane remained open. But passengers who had been ready to scan their boarding passes stayed where they were, watching the scene unfold instead. The departure screen continued flashing on time, yet time itself seemed to have stopped inside Terminal 7. A flight attendant leaned toward her colleague. "Why haven't we started boarding?" "I don't know," the other replied quietly. "Operations told us to wait." The captain stepped halfway out of the cockpit door and looked toward the terminal windows. "Any update?" "Not yet, Captain." He frowned. "This delay doesn't feel routine." Across the gate area, the airline supervisor folded his arms. He had watched the officers question the woman from the very beginning. Something about the encounter bothered him. She had remained respectful. She hadn't argued. She hadn't resisted. Yet every passing minute seemed to increase the officer's determination instead of easing it. He considered walking over. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was. "If I interfere," he whispered to himself, "I'll be accused of obstructing police." His hesitation felt safer than his conscience. A few rows away, 4 professionally dressed passengers exchanged almost invisible glances. None of them joined the whispers spreading through the crowd. One quietly reached into his jacket, unlocked a secure phone, and typed only a few words. "Visual compromised. Subject detained. Immediate response required." He pressed send. The phone disappeared back into his pocket. No expression crossed his face. The others simply nodded once. To everyone else, they looked like ordinary business travelers waiting for a delayed flight. No one noticed. The message quietly leaving the airport through encrypted channels. No one imagined people in distant. Officers were already reading it. Every eye remained fixed on the woman surrounded by officers. Meanwhile, the real emergency was unfolding somewhere else entirely, inside airport operations. A desk phone that almost never rang suddenly came to life. Its sharp tone cut through the room. 3 employees looked at one another. No one reached for it immediately. Somehow, they all sensed this call was different. The ringing phone echoed through airport operations until a senior coordinator finally picked it up. Airport operations. A calm voice answered immediately. This is the Federal Joint Operations Center. Verify your identity. The coordinator straightened. This is Daniel Mercer, Operations Supervisor. Mr. Mercer, this call is encrypted. Do not place me on hold. Do not transfer this line. Daniel glanced around the room. Every conversation behind him faded. I understand. We're tracking an incident at Gate 34. His heartbeat quickened. Yes! Local officers have detained a female passenger. Who authorized interference with that contact? I don't know. Then answer one question. Daniel reached for the incident report, lying beside the keyboard. I'm listening. Confirm the subject's identity. Outside the operations office, the terminal remained trapped inside its own version of the story. Passengers continued recording. Whispers spread from row to row. The officers stayed focused on the woman, believing they still controlled the situation. No one outside knew an entirely different conversation had begun behind secured doors. Daniel pressed his radio. Officer Hayes. Operations. The lead officer answered almost instantly. Go ahead. Federal. Operations requests. Identity verification. Hayes. Frowned. We already identified her. Read it again. Hayes looked at the woman's identification card. He spoke clearly into the radio. Maya Brooks. The operations room became completely silent. Daniel waited. Nothing. Came back. Not static. Not breathing. Nothing. Yes, I slowly looked at the employees surrounding him. One whispered, "Why aren't they answering?" No one knew. 5 long seconds passed. Then the federal voice returned, lower than before. Repeat the full name. Daniel swallowed. Supervisory Special Agent Maya Brooks. Another silence, longer this time. Finally, the voice spoke with unmistakable urgency. Do not move her. Daniel blinked. Sir, what's happening? You'll receive instructions shortly. The line remained open, but no explanation followed. Daniel looked through the glass toward Terminal 7. For the first time that morning, he wasn't worried about a delayed flight. He was worried the airport had just made a mistake that could never be hidden. Daniel lowered the phone with trembling hands. But the world outside the operations office had already moved beyond anything he could stop. Across social media, live streams multiplied by the second. One caption read, "Airport police detained suspicious woman before flight." Another declared, "Quick action prevents possible threat." Millions of people watched. Clips only seconds long. Almost nobody asked what had happened before the recording began. Comments flooded every platform. They did the right thing. Better safe than sorry. She looks guilty. A few voices questioned the arrest. Did anyone see her actually do anything? Their comments disappeared beneath thousands of confident opinions. Inside a nearby newsroom, a producer looked at the trending feeds. "Everyone's covering this," the reporter asked. "Do we have confirmation?" "Not yet, so we wait." The producer shook his head. "If we wait, we're lost." Minutes later, breaking news alerts appeared across countless phones. The story spread faster than anyone could investigate it. Back inside Terminal 7, Maya Brooks remained silent. The handcuffs rested against her wrists. But her attention wasn't on herself. She glanced briefly toward the terminal entrance, not because she expected rescue, because she was calculating time. Every passing minute widened a gap somewhere else. Officer. Hayes noticed her looking away, expecting someone. She met his eyes calmly. I'm hoping you understand what this delay is costing. He dismissed the answer. You can explain everything later. A faint sadness crossed her face. I was trying to prevent. Later. He didn't understand. Neither did the passengers watching nearby. But inside Federal, offices hundreds of miles away, maps covered conference tables, secure phones rang non-stop. An analyst looked up from a monitor. We've lost contact with the surveillance team. Another replied quietly. The airport detention changed everything. The room fell silent. One interrupted. Operation had begun exposing years of ignored assumptions. The airport believed it had stopped a suspect. It had actually stopped the people, trying to stop something far bigger. And before anyone inside Terminal 7 realized it, the consequences were already racing toward them. Ma'am, they've already cleared Gate C. Maya Brooks gave the slightest nod without looking away from the moving crowd. Stay with the schedule. Nobody changes position unless I say so. The voice inside her hidden earpiece fell silent. She slipped the device deeper beneath her hair and adjusted the strap of her worn carry-on. To everyone nearby, she looked like another tired black traveler, waiting for a delayed boarding call. Nobody could see the years she had spent earning the trust of Homeland Security and FBI investigators. An elderly woman smiled at her. Maya returned the smile, calm and polite. You traveling alone? The woman asked. Yes, ma'am. Safe travels. You too. The brief kindness reminded Maya why she accepted assignments like this. Most strangers judged nothing. Others judged everything. Her heartbeat stayed steady. Months of undercover work had taught her patience. Every controlled breath protected evidence far more valuable than her own comfort. A quiet voice returned through the earpiece. Movement near the coffee stand. 2 possible targets. I see them. Maya answered softly, barely moving her lips. 3 people crossed the terminal exactly where intelligence reports predicted. 1 man carried a black duffel bag. A woman walked several steps behind him, pretending not to know him. A frightened teenage girl followed, never lifting her eyes from the floor. Maya memorized every face. Do not approach, she whispered. Confirmed, she slowly picked up her boarding pass, pretending to read the departure time while secretly watching the suspected traffickers through the reflection in the terminal window. Then, heavy footsteps interrupted everything. There she is, an officer said. Another officer pointed directly toward Maya. Mom, stand up! Passengers immediately turned their heads. Maya looked once toward the suspects. They kept walking without hesitation. She understood the danger before anyone else did. If every camera, officer, and traveler focused on her, nobody would notice the people she had spent months tracking. She stood calmly, hiding the disappointment behind steady eyes. The operation had not been destroyed by criminals. It had been interrupted by assumptions. The first officer lowered his radio. Dispatch says the caller identified a suspicious black woman near Gate C. What exactly did she do? Another officer asked. A brief silence followed. They didn't say. So we're stopping her because someone felt uncomfortable. The report says possible criminal activity. Possible isn't evidence. It was enough to send us. Maya remained still, watching the traffickers disappear deeper into the terminal. I'll cooperate, she said quietly. But may I ask what law I've broken? We're asking the questions. Her calm voice never changed. I understand. The officers exchanged quick glances. Her expensive briefcase, tailored jacket, and patient expression should have suggested professionalism. Instead, ordinary details became suspicious because someone had already decided how the story should end. Nearby travelers whispered, "She doesn't look dangerous. You never know." Maybe the officers know something. Nobody asked whether anyone actually knew anything. The moment reminded Maya of stories she had heard from other black travelers during training sessions. A businessman delayed because someone questioned his laptop. A college student searched 3 times before boarding. A retired teacher forced to explain why she could afford first class. Every complaint had ended the same way. Misunderstanding. Years earlier, one young officer had challenged those reports. Why are these complaints always dismissed? A senior supervisor barely looked up from his paperwork. "We've heard these complaints before. Shouldn't that concern us? It means people complain, that's all." The conversation had ended there, but the message had lasted for years. Back in the present, another officer reached toward Maya's bag. The traffickers were now almost beyond sight. One agent's voice crackled urgently inside Maya's hidden earpiece. "They're moving." "I know," Maya whispered. "We're losing them." She closed her eyes. For one brief second, the greatest threat inside the terminal was walking away untouched, while every available officer surrounded the wrong person. This disaster had not begun. With one anonymous call, it had grown through countless ignored warnings, routine assumptions, quiet paperwork, and ordinary decisions repeated until prejudice no longer looked unusual. It simply looked like procedure. Target. Alpha is changing direction. The urgent message echoed through Maya's hidden earpiece, just as the cold metal handcuffs tightened around her wrists. She lowered her eyes for a moment, not because she felt defeated, but because she instantly understood what had been lost. Months of planning had depended on one simple rule: never become the center of attention. An agent's controlled voice broke the silence. "We've lost visual contact," another answered. Immediately, camera 3 is blocked by the crowd. Switch to camera 6. Negative. Subjects are separating. Across the terminal, surveillance monitors that had tracked every careful movement suddenly showed only passengers gathering around Maya's arrest. Federal agents watched helplessly as their coordinated coverage dissolved into confusion. "Where's Maya?" "No updates. She's compromised." The suspected traffickers slowed their pace. One man glanced toward the growing crowd surrounding the officers. "Something's wrong," he muttered. His partner answered quietly, "Keep walking. Don't look back." Years spent avoiding police had sharpened their instincts. They did not know why officers had flooded the gate, but experience told them never to ignore unexpected attention. Several yards behind them, 3 frightened victims followed silently. The youngest girl looked around nervously. "Can we stop?" "No," the trafficker answered coldly. "Keep moving." Inside the federal command vehicle, nobody raised their voice. "Backup teams, adjust your positions. Unit 4, cover the east exit. Unit 7, move toward the parking structure. Copy." The calm instructions barely concealed growing urgency. Every passing second widened the distance between trained investigators and the people they had promised to rescue outside. Unmarked vehicles changed routes without hesitation. Additional surveillance teams abandoned original assignments, hoping to rebuild a plan already falling apart. Back near Gate C, passengers continued recording Maya as officers surrounded her. "She's definitely under arrest. I wonder what she did." Nobody realized the real emergency was no longer standing beside the gate. It was quietly walking toward the terminal exit, while every camera captured one innocent woman in handcuffs. 3 terrified victims drifted farther from safety, disappearing behind ordinary crowds that never noticed the difference. "Freeze those archives." Their order echoed through the Internal Affairs records room. as investigators pulled another aging storage box onto a steel table. Dust covered the faded labels, but the dates stretched back nearly a decade. How many complaints? More than anyone reported. An investigator opened the first folder. This traveler was stopped 3 times in 1 year. For what reason? Suspicious behavior. What behavior? A long pause followed. It doesn't say. Another file described a black family delayed before every international flight. Outcome: no policy violation. Witness statements. Missing. The silence inside the room grew heavier with every page. One investigator sighed. These weren't isolated. Flashbacks unfolded through the reports like forgotten memories. A black businessman questioned while carrying nothing more than a laptop. A retired couple separated for additional screening without explanation. A college athlete surrounded by officers after another. Traveler claimed he looked nervous. Different. Names. Different years. The same. Conclusion: no action taken. Former airport employees were called for interviews. Did you notice a pattern? One investigator asked. A retired gate supervisor looked down before answering. We all noticed. Why didn't anyone speak? We thought someone above us already knew, and if they did, they never acted. Complaint after complaint revealed the same outcome. Travelers waited months for responses that never arrived. Internal reviews disappeared behind closed office doors. Recommendations were softened until uncomfortable facts sounded harmless. One personnel file stopped the room cold. This officer received 2 profiling complaints. And then? He was promoted. Another investigator frowned. So were 3 others. Nobody celebrated impressive performance records anymore. Every promotion now raised another question. What exactly were we rewarding? The answer lingered without being spoken. Not excellence. Silence. The lead investigator slowly closed another folder. This culture wasn't created overnight. No. It was built one ignored report at a time. More. Sealed boxes were opened. Forgotten witness statements. Disciplinary recommendations. Handwritten notes. And overlooked interviews slowly connected into one unmistakable history. The department had spent years trying to leave these records untouched. Now, those forgotten files spoke with a clarity no public statement could erase. For the first time, the strongest evidence against the system was not standing in front of cameras. It was waiting, quietly inside its own archives. The investigation room remained unusually quiet after the archive boxes were sealed. Every document had raised difficult questions, but one officer could not stop thinking about the woman sitting in custody. The rookie glanced toward his field notebook. Something doesn't fit. His training officer looked up. What doesn't? The arrest. It was handled, was it? The older officer folded his arms. You'll understand after a few years. The rookie remembered his first day at the academy. One instructor had repeated the same lesson until every recruit could recite it without hesitation. Evidence first, action second. Never reverse them. Those words echoed, louder now than they had during training. He replayed the encounter in his mind. Maya had stayed calm. She had answered every question. She had never resisted. Yet handcuffs came before proof. He walked toward the report table, where several senior officers were reviewing paperwork. Can I ask something? One detective nodded. Go ahead. The rookie kept his voice respectful. What exactly was our probable cause? Pens stopped moving. One officer adjusted a stack of files. Another suddenly became interested in his computer screen. Nobody answered. After several uncomfortable seconds, the rookie quietly repeated, himself. I'm only asking because I couldn't identify the crime. A veteran officer finally spoke. We received a suspicious person call. I understand that, but What evidence confirmed the report? Again, silence. No one could point to a witness statement describing criminal behavior. No surveillance. Footage showed wrongdoing. No, physical evidence existed. The rookie slowly lowered his notebook. For the first time, experience no longer looked like wisdom. It looked like protection. He watched respected officers defend one another without examining the decision itself. There, realization unsettled him far more than the arrest ever had. Around the room, conversations became shorter, confident, voices softened. Several officers quietly reread their own reports. The single unanswered question continued, spreading through every corner of the office. Nobody argued. Nobody celebrated. Nobody claimed the arrest had been perfect anymore. As the rookie closed his notebook, he understood that accountability rarely begins with dramatic speeches. Sometimes it starts when one honest question refuses to disappear, leaving everyone else to confront the answer they can no longer avoid. The rookie's question continued echoing through the department long after nobody answered it. Wanting certainty instead of opinions, investigators requested every camera angle from Terminal 7. If memories could disagree, the recordings could not. Start from 10 minutes before the stop. The lead investigator said. The technician nodded. Rolling now. Security footage filled the monitors. Maya appeared near the boarding gate, standing quietly with her carry-on beside her. She checked the departure screen, glanced briefly across the terminal, then calmly looked back at her boarding pass. She greeted an elderly traveler with a polite smile before returning to silent observation. Pause there, the investigator said. What do you see? The room stayed quiet. No threatening behavior. Someone finally admitted. The video continued. Passengers walked naturally around her. Children laughed. Families boarded nearby flights. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing matched the suspicious image described in the original report. Then the officers entered. Play it slower. Every command echoed clearly through the speakers. Ma'am, stand up. Maya complied immediately. Place your bag down. She obeyed. Keep your hands where we can see them. Without hesitation, she did exactly that. The lead investigator leaned forward. Did she refuse anything? No. Did she threaten anyone? No. Did she attempt to leave? Another pause. No. The tension on screen came from one direction alone. With every passing second, the officers became more forceful. While Maya remained calm, nobody interrupted the playback anymore. The room watched in complete silence as the same sequence unfolded again. Expressions changed. Confident faces slowly hardened into regret. Supervisors wrote fewer notes. Several officers quietly lowered their eyes. Each replay weakened the official explanation another little more. Small details connected into one unavoidable conclusion, observable. Behavior had never justified the arrest. Assumptions had. When the final frame froze, nobody searched for another witness. The clearest testimony had already been given. The cameras had recorded every second without prejudice, fear, loyalty, or opinion. Like human memory, they never looked away. Neither could anyone else now. The final security monitor faded to black just as another officer hurried into the room. They're here. No one asked who. Everyone already? Understood. Outside Terminal 7, 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled quietly to the curb. Their doors opened without flashing lights, sirens, or dramatic commands. Men and women in dark suits stepped onto the sidewalk with calm purpose, carrying briefcases instead of urgency. Their discipline spoke louder than any emergency response ever could. Airport employees instinctively moved aside. The lead agent entered first. Federal investigation, she said, displaying her credentials. Silence swept across the terminal. Conversations stopped. Radio traffic faded even. The officers, who had confidently directed passengers only minutes earlier, took an uncertain step backward. Another agent walked directly toward Maya. Agent Brooks. She looked up and gave a small nod. I'm glad you made it. We're taking it from here. The arresting officers exchanged uneasy glances. Whispered, she's federal. Before anyone could answer, the lead agent turned toward them. Which officer authorized interference with an active federal operation? Nobody spoke. The question remained suspended in the air, heavier than every command that had echoed through the terminal. Earlier, I asked a simple question. An officer cleared his throat. We received a suspicious person. Report. The agent's expression never changed. What? Evidence confirmed criminal activity before the detention. Another silence. Several officers looked toward one another, hoping someone else would answer. Nobody did. Every explanation that had sounded convincing an hour earlier now felt painfully incomplete. Around them, passengers who had been recording. The arrest lowered their phones. I thought she was dangerous. So did I. Maybe we judged too quickly. The whispers spread quietly through the crowd. People replayed the scene inside their own minds, noticing details they had ignored before. The woman had never argued. She had never resisted. She had simply remained calm. The lead federal agent removed a folder from her briefcase. This operation involved human trafficking suspects and endangered victims. No raised voice followed. None was necessary. Control had already changed hands. For the first time that day, authority belonged to the people asking for evidence instead of assumptions. And as Maya's handcuffs were finally unlocked, the investigation itself began moving toward the truth that prejudice had delayed, but could no longer prevent. The terminal seemed frozen, but the real danger had already started moving. While investigators realized their attention had drifted toward the wrong person, the traffickers quietly adjusted their plans without attracting suspicion. Years of escaping detection had taught them that confusion created opportunities, and the public arrest unfolding nearby looked exactly like the distraction they needed. None of the passengers noticed their subtle reactions, because every eye remained fixed on Maya. One man lowered his phone and murmured, "Something changed." Another answered without looking up. Then we changed too. No panic touched their voices. Calm decisions had kept them hidden for years, and they trusted discipline more than speed. One suspect stepped away from the boarding line, as though answering a routine call. Another collected a small travel bag and blended into a different stream of passengers, heading toward another concourse. Their movements appeared completely ordinary. Across the terminal, an undercover agent whispered into an encrypted radio. Targets are shifting positions. Visual contact is breaking. Stay with them. The supervisor replied. Do not lose all three. We're trying. Airport announcements echoed overhead, while additional officers closed nearby corridors. Travelers complained about delays. Children asked impatient questions, and airline employees struggled to calm growing frustration. Behind that everyday confusion, valuable seconds disappeared. A surveillance specialist stared at the tracking screen. They're using the crowd. They know something's wrong. Another agent said quietly. The supervisor took a slow breath. The arrest gave them warning. Those words settled heavily across the command channel. Every delayed decision widened the distance between investigators and the people they were hunting. Maya remained surrounded by officers, unable to help the team, watching the operation slip away piece by piece. Then another transmission broke the silence. Possible sighting near the East Security checkpoint. The supervisor answered immediately. All units move. Forget appearances. Find the real threat. Only then did everyone begin understanding the painful truth. Maya had never been the danger standing beside the gate. She had been the distraction that allowed the real criminals to disappear almost unnoticed through the crowded airport. Standing in the middle of Terminal 7, the arresting officer no longer noticed the noise surrounding him. Federal agents spoke quietly with supervisors. Passengers whispered among themselves. And cameras continued recording. Yet every sound seemed distant. The weight pressing against him came from somewhere deeper. His badge, once a symbol of certainty, suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. He looked toward Maya, still composed despite everything she had endured. "I thought we were protecting people," he whispered. A senior federal agent answered calmly. "Protection begins with evidence, officer, not assumptions." Those words settled harder than any accusation. Old memories surfaced without warning. A nervous teenager stopped during a routine patrol. A businessman questioned outside an airport gate. A family searched after an anonymous tip proved meaningless. Each report had been closed, each complaint forgotten. Yet every face returned with painful clarity. "They kept telling me they hadn't done anything," he murmured. No one replied. The silence forced him to remember what paperwork never had. He lowered his eyes as another investigator replayed the airport footage. Every frame exposed the same truth. Maya had remained respectful from the beginning. The escalation had come from uniforms, not resistance. What he once defended as instinct now looked painfully different. "I never even questioned the call," he admitted quietly. "You accepted it," the investigator replied. "That's the difference." Around him, fellow officers stood farther away than before. Earlier, they had supported every decision without hesitation. Now conversation stopped when he approached. No one criticized him openly, but no one rushed to defend him either. Their distance revealed that confidence built on shared assumptions disappears. Quickly when accountability arrives, the officer took a slow breath. "I spent years believing. Experience made me right." The federal agent met his eyes. "Experience should make you more careful." Those words remained with him long after the discussion ended. Before any disciplinary hearing, suspension, or official investigation could begin, he already understood what had been taken away. His greatest loss was not the badge pinned to his uniform. It was the trust people once placed in the person wearing it, and he knew earning that trust again would be far harder than wearing authority ever had been. Standing in the same terminal where suspicion had spread so quickly, Maya remained perfectly still as a federal agent approached. Without ceremony, he unlocked the handcuffs and gently removed them from her wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed through the quiet hallway. No one applauded. No announcement declared her innocent. Somehow, the silence surrounding her freedom carried more weight than the noise that had accompanied her arrest. She slowly rubbed the faint red marks around her wrists before letting her hands fall naturally to her sides. Her posture never changed. There was no anger on her face, no demand for sympathy, and no satisfaction in watching others struggle with regret. She had protected countless lives through patience before, and she would not abandon that discipline now. The arresting officer stepped forward, unable to hide the shame written across his face. "I was wrong," he said softly. "I'm truly sorry." Maya looked at him for a brief moment before answering. "I wasn't the person who needed protecting." Today, her quiet reply settled over the terminal more heavily than any public accusation could have. Every federal agent understood exactly what she meant. The operation had never been about her reputation. 3 innocent victims were still waiting for help, and every wasted minute had placed them in greater danger. Passengers slowly lowered their phones. A woman who had been recording slipped her device into her purse. A businessman looked toward the floor instead of meeting Maya's eyes. Parents quietly pulled their children closer. The crowd finally understood they had witnessed courage, not criminality. No officer offered another excuse. Their shoulders lowered, conversations disappeared, and even routine movements became hesitant. The authority they had relied upon moments earlier now felt painfully hollow beside Maya's composure. The lead federal agent nodded toward the exit. "We still have people to save," Maya answered with a calm nod. "Then let's finish what we came here to do." She walked beside the agents without looking back. Behind her, the terminal remained wrapped in thoughtful silence. The wrongful arrest had finally ended, but its consequences had only begun, reaching beyond the airport walls. Justice had spoken without raising its voice. And everyone who witnessed that moment knew they would remember its quiet echo forever. Before sunrise, satellite trucks already lined the courthouse entrance. Reporters adjusted cameras, producers rehearsed opening lines, and photographers searched for the perfect angle. Everyone sensed this had grown beyond a single arrest. What began inside Terminal 7 now stood ready to challenge public confidence in institutions trusted to protect justice instead of prejudice. The atmosphere felt heavy long before the first official arrived. Department leaders stepped through the courthouse doors beneath relentless flashes. Their polished confidence had vanished overnight. Questions followed every step. "Chief, who approved the arrest? Why wasn't the evidence verified first? How many similar complaints were ignored?" No one answered immediately. Advisors exchanged anxious glances while microphones stretched closer. The familiar certainty that usually accompanied public statements had quietly disappeared. The department spokesperson finally approached the podium. "We remain committed to transparency while the investigation continues." A reporter interrupted. "When did transparency begin? Before or after the federal investigation exposed the mistakes?" Silence settled across the room. Another journalist stood. "How many complaints involving racial profiling were dismissed during the past 5 years?" The spokesperson shuffled prepared notes. "We're currently reviewing historical records, so the public should believe those complaints mattered only after national attention arrived." Again, no immediate response followed. Every hesitation deepened the growing unease inside the room. Cameras captured lowered eyes, whispered conversations, and officials searching for words that refused to erase documented evidence. The discussion gradually expanded beyond Maya's arrest. Reporters referenced forgotten investigations, archived complaints, and testimony from former employees. Each question reached further into the department's history, exposing patterns that paperwork had hidden, but victims had always remembered. Among the audience, even longtime supporters exchanged uncertain looks. "This isn't only about one case anymore," someone whispered. Another quietly nodded. "It never was." Outside the courthouse, Maya stood beside federal colleagues, but declined repeated interview requests. "Agent Brooks, how do you feel today?" She answered calmly. "My feelings are not the story. The truth is," she offered nothing more. Her restraint contrasted sharply with the visible discomfort surrounding department officials. While others searched desperately for explanations, Maya refused to transform personal suffering into public theater. Eventually, the conference ended. Officials stepped away from the podium, but reporters remained, continuing discussions as cameras slowly powered down. No verdict had been announced, yet everyone recognized that accountability had already entered the conversation. The building settled into an unusual silence. It felt less like relief than acceptance. Maya walked toward the courthouse steps, knowing justice had finally reached the place where assumptions once stood unchallenged. Outside, citizens left asking fewer questions about one woman in handcuffs and far more about the system that had placed them there. Long before the evening news began, investigators authorized the release of the complete airport security footage. Networks stopped replaying short viral clips and aired the full timeline instead. Millions watched uninterrupted recordings from Terminal 7, seeing every moment exactly as it happened. For the first time, public opinion rested on evidence instead of fragments, revealing details that edited videos had never shown. Every camera angle confirmed the same sequence. Maya waited calmly near her gate, checked her boarding information, answered each question respectfully, and never displayed panic or aggression. Officers approached with growing authority while she remained composed. Different perspectives showed identical events, making it impossible to blame selective editing or misleading viewpoints for what audiences now witnessed. A television anchor paused before speaking. She never resisted. The legal analyst beside him nodded. Not once. Those simple observations carried more weight than hours of earlier debate. Viewers watched Maya cooperate from beginning to end. She never argued, threatened anyone, or attempted to leave. The frightening image created during the first headlines quietly disappeared beneath undeniable facts preserved by silent cameras. Even more striking was what the recordings lacked. There were no raised voices from Maya, no sudden movements, and no behavior suggesting immediate danger. The loudest accusation became the silence surrounding her actions. Every peaceful response forced audiences to reconsider why force had seemed acceptable in the first place. Across social media, conversations shifted noticeably. "I defended the officers too quickly." One comment admitted, "I should have waited for the evidence." Another read, thousands echoed similar reflections. Certainty slowly gave way to humility, as replay after replay dismantled assumptions formed during the earliest reports. Inside police stations and airport offices, employees watched the footage together. Few spoke during the recordings. Some lowered their heads, while others quietly replayed critical moments without saying a word. The evidence demanded no dramatic narration because every unnecessary escalation remained visible. Meanwhile, Maya declined interviews once again. "Will you respond to today's release?" A reporter asked. She smiled gently. "The truth already has." Nothing more needed saying. As the final recording ended, millions realized they had witnessed far more than one wrongful arrest. They had watched unconscious bias, institutional habits, and unquestioned assumptions collide within ordinary moments. Terminal 7 became more than a location. It became a mirror, reflecting how quickly appearances can outweigh evidence. From that day forward, people stopped asking whether Maya seemed suspicious and began asking why suspicion had seemed so easy to believe. In the first place, the release of the federal report marked a turning point no press conference could match. Weeks of careful investigation had produced a document built entirely on verified evidence rather than public opinion. Every conclusion rested on surveillance footage, communication logs, witness interviews, and official records. Speculation quietly gave way to facts as readers followed a detailed timeline that replaced rumors with documented truth from beginning to end. The report reconstructed every critical minute of the operation. It traced the planning meetings, undercover assignments, surveillance positions, and coordinated movements leading to Terminal 7. Readers saw how months of disciplined preparation unraveled within minutes after Maya's detention. What had seemed like an isolated airport incident was revealed as the interruption of a carefully organized federal mission. One section drew particular attention. Agent Maya Brooks was participating in a joint federal task force investigating an active human trafficking network. The sentence changed everything. For the first time, the public understood Maya had not simply been traveling. She had occupied a carefully planned position within an operation designed to rescue vulnerable victims and apprehend dangerous suspects. Her silence throughout the ordeal had protected far more than her own identity. The report continued with sobering detail. Several trafficking suspects escaped immediate capture during the confusion created by the wrongful arrest. Behind those escaped suspects were 3 victims whose rescue had been delayed. Their families waited longer because critical resources had been redirected toward an innocent federal agent instead of dangerous criminals. The evidence remained remarkably consistent. Body camera footage matched airport surveillance. Radio transmissions aligned with witness statements. Communication logs confirmed the timeline. Every independent source supported the same conclusion, leaving almost no room for competing explanations or comforting excuses. As agencies reviewed the findings, their language changed noticeably. We acknowledge the report's conclusions. One official stated, another simply added, the evidence speaks for itself. Meanwhile, Maya declined another opportunity to address the media. Would you like to comment? A reporter asked. She answered with quiet confidence. The report already has. Her restraint carried unusual strength. While institutions release lengthy statements, Maya trusted documented truth more than personal emotion. That choice only strengthened public confidence in her character. When the final page reached the public, the conversation expanded beyond one airport, one officer, or one investigation. Communities began examining training, accountability, and the hidden influence of racial assumptions throughout everyday policing. The federal report officially closed one case, yet it opened a much larger national discussion. In the end, its greatest impact was not explaining what happened to Maya, but revealing how ordinary assumptions could quietly place entire systems on the wrong side of justice. The hearing room felt different from every meeting that had come before it. There were no confident conversations in the hallway, no reassuring smiles, and no expectation that routine procedures would make the problem disappear. Although the doors remained closed, everyone understood the nation was waiting outside. Senior officers entered quietly, taking their seats beneath the weight of evidence that had already reshaped public trust. As the review began, stacks of old complaint files rested beside fresh investigative reports. Every document seemed to represent another missed opportunity. Forgotten warnings, delayed investigations, and overlooked concerns no longer felt like isolated mistakes. Together, they painted a history no one in the room could honestly dismiss. The police chief slowly removed his glasses and looked around the table. His face showed fatigue instead of authority. I've reviewed every report, he said quietly. Nobody interrupted. I've watched every recording. Again, only silence answered. He folded his hands before continuing. We failed both justice and judgment. The words settled heavily across the room. They carried no anger and offered no protection. For the first time since Maya's arrest, the department's highest-ranking officer acknowledged that the failure reached beyond procedure. It reflected a deeper inability to separate evidence from assumption. Several officers lowered their eyes. Others stared silently at unopened notebooks resting before them. No one attempted to challenge the chief's conclusion because the evidence had already spoken with greater clarity than any argument ever could. A deputy chief finally broke the silence. We believed policy justified our actions. The chief shook his head gently. Policy exists to protect people. It was never meant to protect poor judgment. No one replied. The conversation shifted toward accountability instead of defense. Officials who had previously supported the arrest now discussed independent oversight, improved training, and stronger review procedures. Their words sounded noticeably different, reflecting an institution beginning to step away from decisions it could no longer justify. Maya remained absent from the hearing room. When the chief finished speaking, the room fell completely still. Nobody defended the past. Nobody questioned the conclusion. Outside those walls, reforms, disciplinary actions, and policy changes would continue for months. Inside that quiet room, however, the most important change had already happened. The department finally admitted that justice had failed. Long before Maya Brooks ever felt cold handcuffs close around her wrists. And that truth would forever reshape the badge they wore together. The courtroom doors closed quietly behind the last witness, leaving an unusual stillness hanging in the air. When the arresting officer stepped forward, he looked nothing like the confident man who had ordered Maya into handcuffs inside Terminal 7. His shoulders carried the weight of weeks without sleep, and the badge on his chest no longer seemed to offer certainty. It simply reminded him of choices he could never take back. For several seconds, he avoided looking toward Maya. Then slowly, he lifted his eyes. She met his gaze without anger, without accusation, without triumph. For the first time since the airport confrontation, he was not looking at a suspect, a report, or a uniform. He was looking at another human being whose life had been interrupted because of his decision. His voice trembled. I've replayed that day every night. No one interrupted. I kept asking myself what I missed. He paused before. Taking a slow breath, the answer was, I never actually saw you. The courtroom remained perfectly silent. I saw a report, he continued quietly. I saw expectations. I saw what I thought I was supposed to see. His hands tightened together. But I never saw you. Those words settled over the room more heavily than any legal argument presented throughout the hearing. They exposed something far deeper than procedural failure. They revealed how assumptions had quietly replaced observation long before anyone reached for handcuffs. The officer swallowed hard. I only saw what I expected. Across the courtroom, several spectators lowered their eyes. Reporters stopped writing for a moment. Even the judge remained still, allowing the confession to breathe without interruption. Maya listened without changing her expression. She offered no celebration, no criticism, no demand for punishment. Her silence allowed his honesty to stand on its own. The officer looked down before speaking once more. I can't change what happened, Maya answered, softly. No, another brief silence followed. But you can change what happens. Next, he nodded slowly, understanding that those few words carried both responsibility and hope. People sitting in the gallery exchanged thoughtful glances instead of whispers. The atmosphere had shifted away from blame toward reflection. Long before any formal ruling could be announced, everyone understood the greatest transformation had already begun inside the man standing before them. When the testimony ended, no applause followed. None was needed. His confession could never erase Maya's humiliation or restore the lost moments of the federal operation. Yet by admitting that bias had shaped his judgment, he accomplished something denial never could. In that quiet courtroom, justice became more than punishment. It became the courage to recognize prejudice, confront it honestly, and refuse to let it shape another innocent life. The judge's invitation lingered in the silent courtroom. As Maya rose from her seat, every reporter lifted a pen. Every camera focused on her face. She adjusted the sleeve of her jacket, glanced briefly toward the gallery, then looked directly at the bench. Despite everything she had endured, there was no bitterness in her eyes. The room expected an emotional confrontation after weeks of headlines and investigations. Instead, her calm presence alone changed the atmosphere. Even those who had doubted her found themselves leaning forward, waiting to hear what she would choose to say. An attorney quietly stepped back from the microphone. giving her the space to speak. One reporter whispered, "She's earned the right to say anything she wants." Another nodded without answering. Maya took a slow breath before breaking the silence. "I'm not standing here because I need revenge," she said softly. "I'm standing here because too many people never received the chance to be heard." The words settled gently across the courtroom. Officers lowered their eyes. Reporters stopped typing for a moment, realizing compassion had entered a room prepared for condemnation instead. She turned slightly toward the officers before continuing. "Dignity shouldn't depend on a badge, a title, or federal credentials." Her voice never rose above a conversation. "It belongs to every person before introductions begin." A quiet murmur moved through the public gallery, before disappearing again. The judge folded his hands without interrupting. One senior officer removed his glasses, staring silently at the table. No legal argument carried the same emotional weight because her words reached beyond policy and touched personal responsibility. After another brief pause, Maya continued, "Respect should exist before any questions are asked. If someone must prove their worth before receiving basic fairness, then justice has already fallen behind." Nobody applauded. Nobody objected. The silence itself became the response. It honored not only Maya's experience, but countless people whose stories had never reached a courtroom. Several journalists exchanged thoughtful glances, understanding they were witnessing something larger than one legal proceeding. When Maya stepped away from the microphone, she offered no dramatic farewell. She simply nodded respectfully toward the judge before returning to her seat. The courtroom remained unusually still. Long after the hearing adjourned, her quiet words continued traveling through conversations, headlines, and hearts, reminding everyone that equality begins long before verdicts are announced. It begins the moment strangers choose humanity over assumption, fairness over fear, and compassion over unchecked authority every single day. As Maya stepped away from the courtroom microphone, the applause that many expected never came. Instead, attention slowly shifted away from legal arguments and public debate toward the people whose lives had nearly disappeared behind the chaos at the airport. The headlines had focused on one wrongful arrest, but the mission had always been larger than one person. Somewhere beyond the cameras were frightened victims who had spent years waiting for someone to find them. Their freedom, not public attention, remained the true purpose behind every sacrifice made throughout the investigation. Although the airport incident had disrupted months of undercover work, the federal task force refused to surrender. Agents regrouped immediately, comparing surveillance footage, reviewing communication logs, and rebuilding their operation piece by piece. Long hours turned into sleepless nights as investigators followed every remaining lead. Their determination slowly restored the momentum that had nearly been lost, proving that one painful setback could delay justice without destroying it completely. The mission continued because innocent lives still depended upon their persistence and unwavering commitment. Days later, rescue teams located several victims hidden inside properties connected to the trafficking network. Fear gradually gave way to cautious relief as survivors stepped outside into safety for the first time in years. Wrapped in blankets and surrounded by medical staff, they looked uncertain about the future, yet free from the control that had shaped every previous day. Their quiet courage reminded everyone that survival often requires extraordinary strength, long before rescue finally arrives. Whenever reporters praised Maya for her composure, she gently redirected every compliment. "Please remember the survivors," she said. "They carried the greatest burden. We simply helped them reach the other side." Her words shifted every conversation toward the investigators, counselors, medical teams, and families who continued supporting the victims long after television cameras disappeared. She never allowed personal recognition to overshadow the people whose healing mattered far more than her own public reputation. As official updates continued, public conversations gradually changed. Citizens stopped discussing courtroom victories and began asking how vulnerable people could be protected before becoming victims. The focus moved beyond blame toward prevention, compassion, and meaningful reform. Accountability remained important, but everyone understood that punishment alone could never restore stolen years or erase painful memories. In the end, hope quietly replaced outrage. The greatest victory belonged neither to Maya nor the agencies involved, but to the survivors whose reclaimed lives proved compassion could still overcome fear, injustice, and silence together. The courtroom remained still after the final hearing concluded. Nobody applauded, nobody celebrated, and nobody hurried toward the exits. The silence carried a weight that every person understood without explanation. Justice had finally corrected a terrible wrong, but no decision could erase the fear, humiliation, or uncertainty created by those painful moments. Around the room, families of the rescued survivors embraced one another with trembling relief. Their tears spoke of gratitude, exhaustion, and the fragile realization that only a handful of different choices could have changed every future, forever beyond repair. Several officers stayed quietly in their seats, long after everyone else began leaving. None of them searched for excuses or comforting conversations. They stared at empty tables, replaying decisions that had once seemed routine, but now appeared painfully avoidable. No disciplinary order weighed as heavily as their own reflections. The hardest judgment no longer came from reporters, supervisors, or public opinion. It came from the uncomfortable truth each person carried home, knowing that assumptions had nearly destroyed innocent lives and delayed justice when it mattered most. Throughout the afternoon, television stations continued broadcasting the airport recordings. Every replay encouraged viewers to slow down and notice details they had missed before. Maya never shouted. She never resisted. She never threatened anyone. Instead, audiences watched authority steadily increase the tension, while calm professionalism remained unchanged. The cameras documented regret more clearly than victory. Images leaving the courthouse showed lowered heads, thoughtful faces, and quiet conversations. Instead of celebration, reflection replaced confrontation, reminding millions that accountability often arrives through honest recognition rather than dramatic punishment or public humiliation. Maya quietly walked outside beside her fellow agents, without requesting interviews or acknowledging the waiting cameras. She offered a grateful smile to the rescue teams before stepping into an unmarked vehicle. Her calm departure reminded everyone that character is revealed, not only by surviving injustice, but by refusing to let injustice reshape compassion into bitterness. She left the courthouse exactly as she had entered the airport, focused on protecting others rather than defending herself. Across the country, families discussed the case around dinner tables, classrooms, workplaces, and neighborhood gatherings. Conversations slowly shifted from debating Maya's innocence toward questioning how unconscious bias influences ordinary decisions. Community leaders, law enforcement agencies, and public institutions recognized that admitting mistakes would never be enough. Better training, stronger accountability, and lasting cultural change had become necessary responsibilities. Although the handcuffs were gone, their shadow remained. Long after headlines disappeared, one lasting truth continued echoing through countless lives. Justice begins the moment people choose humanity before assumption, evidence before prejudice, and courage before comfortable silence always. The suspended officers arrived separately, avoiding the conversations that once greeted them every morning. Their badges still reflected the overhead lights as they placed them on the review table, but the symbols no longer carried the same meaning. The uniforms remained neatly pressed, yet the confidence that had once accompanied them had quietly disappeared. Fellow officers watched from across the hallway without speaking. No one celebrated their suspension. The silence itself acknowledged that accountability had finally reached a place many believed it never would. Inside the department, investigators unlocked storage cabinets filled with old reports that had gathered dust for years. Complaints once labeled misunderstandings were carefully reviewed beside newly discovered evidence. Similar patterns appeared again and again, connecting cases that had previously been dismissed as isolated incidents. Supervisors who once signed those files now faced difficult questions about why repeated warnings had never produced meaningful action. Forgotten paperwork slowly became the strongest witness against a culture that had relied too heavily on assumptions instead of careful examination. As news spread that earlier complaints were being reopened, phone lines inside the review office grew busier each day. Former travelers, families, and community members finally believed someone might listen without dismissing their experiences. Some spoke with trembling voices. Others shared written statements they had kept for years, convinced nobody would ever read them. Their stories revealed not only personal pain, but also a shared hope that future generations would never face the same treatment simply because of appearance or background. Within the department, old alliances quietly began fading. Officers who had once defended questionable decisions now stepped back from those conversations, recognizing that loyalty without integrity had damaged public confidence. Community meetings reflected that same cautious attitude. Residents listened respectfully to promises of reform, but expected proof instead of polished speeches. They understood that trust returned slowly, earned through consistent actions, rather than carefully prepared words after public controversy. Each reopened investigation asked the same difficult question: had bias quietly shaped decisions that should have relied only on evidence? Review boards examined every case with greater care, determined not to repeat the mistakes that had harmed Maya and endangered innocent lives. The suspensions were never presented as revenge or victory. Instead, they marked the beginning of genuine responsibility, reminding everyone that authority may come from a uniform, but lasting respect is earned only through fairness, humility, accountability, and unwavering character every day. Months turned into seasons, but the airport recordings never truly disappeared. Television documentaries revisited them. Universities discussed them during ethics courses. Community organizations shared them, while talking about fairness and public responsibility. What had once been viewed as another breaking news clip slowly became something far more meaningful. The footage reminded people that a few rushed assumptions could alter countless lives within minutes. Every replay carried the same quiet warning: justice is never protected by speed alone. It depends upon patience, careful observation, and the willingness to question first impressions before acting. As people watched the recordings again with fresh understanding, details they had once overlooked became impossible to ignore. Maya's calm voice never changed. Her posture remained respectful. Her cooperation never disappeared, even when authority continued escalating the encounter. What many viewers had originally accepted as routine policing now revealed missed opportunities for empathy, restraint, and thoughtful judgment. The greatest lesson was not hidden inside dramatic moments, but within the ordinary choices that slowly transformed a peaceful interaction into a national conversation about bias and accountability. Police academies soon incorporated the footage into classroom discussions. Instructors paused the recordings at critical moments, asking recruits what different decisions could have prevented the entire incident. Rather than encouraging quick conclusions, they emphasized observation, communication, and evidence before action. Cadets studied Maya's composed behavior carefully, learning that calmness should never be mistaken for suspicion. They were reminded that professionalism requires seeing individuals through facts instead of unconscious expectations shaped by appearance, race, or personal assumptions. Outside the classroom, communities also changed the questions they asked. Public meetings focused less on assigning blame and more on preventing future failures through transparency, stronger oversight, and healthier relationships between officers and the people they served. Maya rarely accepted interviews or returned to the spotlight, yet her quiet dignity remained at the center of every discussion. Without demanding recognition, she became a lasting example of courage, expressed through composure instead of anger. Eventually, the airport returned to its familiar rhythm. Travelers hurried through terminals, flights departed on schedule, and daily routines resumed. Yet the recordings continued shaping hearts and decisions. Far beyond that building, every new recruit who studied them carried the same enduring lesson into service. Authority alone never creates justice. Justice begins the moment every person is seen first as a human being, worthy of fairness, dignity, compassion, and equal respect before assumptions are allowed to speak. The impact of Maya's case continued spreading long after the courtroom emptied. People who had spent years believing their experiences would never matter slowly found the courage to come forward. Phone calls reached review officers every week. Emails arrived from travelers, families, and former employees who had quietly accepted disappointment because they believed no one would ever investigate their concerns. For the first time, their stories no longer felt isolated. Together, they revealed a pattern that many had privately recognized, but never imagined would finally receive serious attention from those responsible for protecting public trust. As investigators listened, forgotten voices returned with remarkable strength. Some witnesses carried faded documents they had saved for years. Others brought painful memories they had never shared outside their own families. One by one, their experiences formed a clearer picture of repeated failures hidden beneath routine procedures and institutional confidence. Cases that once appeared unrelated suddenly revealed familiar details, showing how small acts of unchecked bias had quietly affected many innocent people across different places and different years. Old case files were carefully removed from storage and examined with fresh attention. Investigators reviewed neglected reports, body camera recordings, disciplinary records, and witness statements that had gathered dust inside forgotten cabinets. Every reopened file exposed another missed opportunity to choose accountability instead of convenience. What had once disappeared behind paperwork now stood before review boards as undeniable evidence demanding honest answers rather than comfortable explanations. Soon, whispered conversations became official testimony. Community members who had once shared their experiences only with trusted friends confidently appeared before independent panels. Their voices no longer carried hesitation, but determination. Department leaders responded by introducing stronger oversight, public reporting, and clearer review procedures designed to ensure future complaints received careful, transparent consideration. Although rebuilding confidence would require time, these reforms signaled that looking away would no longer be accepted as an acceptable response. Maya never claimed to have changed the system alone, yet her quiet resilience encouraged investigators to examine every complaint with greater fairness and empathy, regardless of who submitted it. Her experience reminded officials that every report deserved thoughtful attention. Lasting change did not arrive through one verdict or one investigation. It grew stronger each time an ordinary person chose honesty over fear. With every new voice refusing to remain silent, justice moved another step forward, proving that accountability flourishes whenever communities refuse to let silence protect injustice again. The department accepted that rebuilding public trust demanded far more than carefully written apologies or public statements. Senior leaders gathered with community representatives, legal advisors, and independent experts to confront the failures exposed by Maya's case. Instead of defending the past, they acknowledged that lasting accountability begins only when institutions recognize the habits that quietly allow injustice to grow. That admission became the foundation for meaningful reform, replacing denial with responsibility and showing employees that real leadership begins by accepting difficult truths rather than avoiding them. Training rooms soon felt different from those of previous years. Officers no longer sat through routine presentations built around policies alone. Instructors used real incidents, including Maya's case, to encourage honest reflection about unconscious bias, communication, and de-escalation. Difficult discussions replaced defensive attitudes as recruits and experienced officers examined how small assumptions could shape major decisions. Every lesson emphasized careful observation, empathy, and evidence before action, reminding everyone that professionalism is measured not by authority, but by fairness under pressure. Beyond the classrooms, meaningful oversight also expanded. A civilian review board received authority to examine serious complaints independently, giving communities greater confidence that investigations would no longer depend entirely on internal judgments. Federal agencies partnered with local departments to strengthen investigative procedures, improve policy reviews, and share best practices. That cooperation reinforced an important message. Protecting public trust requires transparency at every level, not isolated promises made after public controversy has already caused lasting harm. Technology also became part of the solution. Updated body camera policies required earlier activation, secure evidence preservation, and routine audits to ensure encounters were documented completely. The recordings were no longer viewed as simple procedural requirements. They became reliable tools for truth, allowing future investigations to rely on objective evidence instead of conflicting memories or personal assumptions. Officers understood that accurate documentation protected both the public and those committed to serving with integrity. The system remained imperfect, and everyone acknowledged that no reform could erase every mistake overnight. Yet communities noticed genuine progress through consistent actions rather than symbolic gestures. Better conversations replaced old habits. Stronger accountability replaced comfortable silence, and trust slowly began returning. Maya's experience could never be undone, but every fair decision that followed honored the lessons learned from her courage. Each respectful encounter became another quiet victory, proving that steady reform can protect lives and build a more just future for everyone. Months after the hearings ended and reform slowly took root, Maya Brooks returned to the same airport without informing anyone. She carried only a small travel bag and an ordinary boarding pass, blending naturally into the morning crowd. Travelers hurried through the familiar terminal, focused on departures and reunions, unaware they were walking across the same floor where fear, prejudice, and quiet courage had once collided. The building looked unchanged, yet every step reminded Maya that places can remember moments long after people try to forget them. As she approached the same boarding gate, subtle differences immediately caught her attention. Employees greeted every passenger with steady eye contact, and genuine courtesy before checking documents. Conversations sounded calmer. Procedures appeared more deliberate, and supervisors quietly observed interactions without interrupting. A few longtime staff members recognized Maya almost instantly. None approached her directly. They simply offered respectful nods before returning to their work, silently acknowledging how one painful mistake had transformed the culture surrounding that gate. This time, there were no television crews, live streams, flashing cameras, or reporters waiting outside the terminal. The absence of attention felt strangely comforting. Maya was no longer the center of a national controversy. She was simply another passenger preparing for another journey. That ordinary moment became her greatest victory, because dignity no longer required public recognition to prove its value. While waiting to board, a young black girl slowly approached with her mother standing nearby. Looking up with innocent curiosity, she asked softly, "Were you scared?" Maya smiled warmly before kneeling slightly to meet her eyes. "Yes," she answered honestly, "but I was more afraid of what would happen if nobody stood up for what was right." The little girl thought quietly before offering a gentle smile that carried more hope than words ever could. When boarding finally began, Maya picked up her bag and joined the line without special treatment or recognition. As she walked toward the aircraft, she glanced back one final time. The terminal felt peaceful now. She understood that meaningful change rarely arrives through applause or headlines. Sometimes it begins when one child walks away believing courage, fairness, and compassion are always worth protecting, no matter how quietly they first appear together. The terminal slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm, yet something invisible remained suspended in the air. Travelers hurried toward departure gates, announcements echoed overhead, and rolling suitcases crossed polished floors, exactly as they always had. Still, for those who remembered that unforgettable morning, Terminal 7 would never become just another airport again. The memory of cold handcuffs closing around innocent wrists had become part of the building itself, proving that justice delayed leaves wounds that linger long after headlines disappear. No voices were raised anymore. The shouting had faded months ago, replaced by a silence that carried far greater weight. That silence remembered every hurried decision, every uncomfortable glance, every bystander who watched without asking questions, and every official who chose certainty before evidence. It reminded everyone that moments of injustice are often sustained not only by those who act wrongly, but also by those who remain comfortably quiet. Looking back, people understood how quickly one anonymous accusation had spread through the terminal. Suspicion had traveled faster than facts because assumptions required no proof. Truth, however, demanded patience, evidence, and courage before it could finally stand where prejudice had arrived within seconds. That painful lesson became impossible to ignore. The rescued trafficking survivors quietly remained at the heart of everything. Their freedom reminded investigators, officers, and ordinary citizens that one careless mistake had threatened far more than Maya's dignity. 3 vulnerable lives had nearly disappeared, while attention focused on the wrong person. Their recovery became the clearest reminder that justice must protect the innocent before prejudice creates another dangerous distraction. Everyone carried a different burden from that day. Maya left with healing wrists but an unshaken spirit. Several officers lost careers they once believed were secure. Department leaders faced years of rebuilding public confidence. Families questioned institutions they had trusted without hesitation. The consequences reached far beyond one courtroom, one airport, or one investigation. No celebration followed accountability. There were no triumphant speeches or public victories. Those who had defended poor decisions quietly stepped away from old arguments. Pride gradually surrendered to reflection, proving that genuine accountability rarely arrives with applause. It usually begins with honest silence and the willingness to admit painful truths. Across schools, police academies, community meetings, and leadership seminars, the case continued shaping difficult conversations. People stopped discussing only one mistaken arrest and began examining how unconscious bias quietly influences everyday choices. The greatest lesson was never about Maya alone. It became a reminder that every stranger deserves fairness before suspicion. Months later, Maya accepted an invitation to speak briefly during a community forum. Standing before officers, students, survivors, and neighborhood families, she remained calm, just as she had throughout every painful moment. She looked around the room before saying softly, "The most dangerous mistake isn't arresting the wrong person. It's believe